he did it, I can do it.
Shivers went up and down my spine.
I was blown away by it, just like everybody else.
He did some really groundbreaking things.
And 2001 was the picture that just ignited the spark.
Everyone talks about 2001, A Space Odyssey, like it was always a masterpiece, like it arrived fully formed, instantly respected, instantly understood. That's not true. When this movie came out, people walked out. Critics were confused, the studio was nervous, and for a brief moment it looked like one of the most expensive mistakes MGM had ever made. This wasn't a smooth triumph. It was a gamble that almost went sideways. The crazy part is that most of the drama didn't happen on screen. It happened behind the scene, in the decisions Kubrick made, the things he refused to explain, and the risks the studio didn't realize they were taking until it was too late. So forget what you think you know about this movie. This is what really happened with 2001: A Space Odyssey. When MGM greenlit 2001: A Space Odyssey, they did not think they were paying for a cinematic riddle. They thought they were buying prestige. In the early 1960s, MGM was desperate to look serious again. The studio system was cracking, television was eating audiences alive, and flashy musicals weren't enough anymore. What they wanted was a smart film, a future-facing film, something that said, "We still matter." Enter Stanley Kubrick. Kubrick had just delivered Dr. Strangelove, a cold, intelligent hit that made MGM look bold instead of outdated. He wasn't cheap, but he was controlled, meticulous, precise. From the studio's point of view, he was a difficult genius, but still a genius you could manage. Kubrick's pitch sounded reasonable, almost conservative, a serious science fiction film, grounded in real science. No ray guns, no bug-eyed monsters, something that treated space travel like engineering, not fantasy. To reinforce that credibility, Kubrick partnered with Arthur C. Clarke, one of the most respected science fiction writers alive. Clarke wasn't a pulp guy. He wrote about satellites before they existed. He sounded like the future. From MGM's perspective, this checked every box. Smart director, respected author, a genre that was finally growing up. What they didn't understand was how literally Kubrick took the idea of realism. Kubrick didn't want the movie to feel believable. He wanted it to be defensible. Every control panel had to make sense. Every spacecraft movement had to obey physics. Every design choice had to survive scrutiny from actual scientists. If something looked dramatic but wrong, it was gone. This wasn't about pleasing audiences, it was about eliminating excuses, and very quickly the project stopped behaving like a normal movie. Development began in 1964. Scripts were written, discarded, rewritten, then quietly abandoned. The story wasn't locked because Kubrick didn't see the film as a story first. He saw it as a sequence of problems that needed solving. How would people really move in zero gravity? What would astronauts actually see? How quiet would space feel if you stopped pretending it was loud? MGM thought they were funding a film. What they were actually funding was a 4-year experiment in control. And at this stage, they still thought that control belonged to them. They were wrong. The first real problem with 2001 wasn't confusion. It was time. By the mid-1960s, MGM started noticing something uncomfortable. The movie wasn't progressing like a movie. It was progressing like a research project. Kubrick rejected shortcuts as a rule. Matte paintings looked fake to him. Optical cheats looked lazy. Anything that reminded the audience they were watching a movie was a failure. So instead of faking space, he built it. That decision quietly exploded the schedule. Most science fiction films at the time used 20 to 30 effects shots. 2001 would end up needing more than 200. Not because Kubrick wanted spectacle, but because he refused to repeat visual tricks. Every shot had to sell the illusion on its own. This meant months spent on seconds of footage. Douglas Trumbull and the effects team worked shot by shot, frame by frame. A single Moonbus landing sequence took 6 weeks to finish. Starfields weren't painted. They were individually photographed using tiny lights placed against black velvet so they would move correctly relative to the camera. Nothing was fast. Nothing was cheap. Then came the sets. Kubrick didn't want actors pretending to float. He wanted gravity itself to look convincing. So he approved the construction of a massive rotating centrifuge, a 38-foot wide wheel that physically spun while the camera stayed fixed inside it. Actors weren't acting. They were running inside a moving machine. The set alone cost around $750,000, which was insane money for a single effect in 1968. And it took months just to build before anyone could even film a scene. This is where MGM's confidence started cracking. From their point of view, the movie had no obvious anchor, no clear hero arc, no conventional plot progression. Just an ever-growing list of technical demands and invoices. Kubrick didn't help. He demanded dozens of takes for simple action. He scrutinized tiny details nobody in the audience would ever consciously notice. If a movement felt wrong, it didn't matter how long it took. It was redone. Meanwhile, Arthur C. Clarke was cracking under the pressure. The collaboration that looked so clean on paper turned into a grind. Clarke later suffered a bleeding ulcer during production, brought on by stress and exhaustion. Kubrick, on the other hand, doubled down. He worked relentless hours. He micromanaged everything, and the longer the film dragged on, the more convinced he became that compromise was the real enemy. By this point, 2001 had consumed years of development, massive resources, and a studio that was no longer sure what kind of movie it was paying for. But the worst part hadn't happened yet, because Kubrick was about to make a decision that shocked everyone involved and permanently changed the film. Up to this point, MGM could still tell themselves this was just an expensive movie that would eventually come together. Then, Kubrick did something that made everyone realize they were no longer in control. He killed the music. Kubrick had hired Alex North, a respected composer who had already worked with him on Spartacus. North wasn't some random pick. He was a safe choice, professional, reliable, studio approved. North spent months composing a full orchestral score. It was recorded, it was paid for. From MGM's perspective, this was one of the few normal parts of the production. Kubrick listened to the finished music and rejected all of it. Not revised, not trimmed, completely abandoned. Instead, Kubrick replaced the score with pre-existing classical music, Strauss, Ligeti, pieces he'd been using as temporary tracks during editing and never let go of. North wasn't even told directly. He found out after the fact, when the film premiered, and his music simply wasn't there. That decision alone would have been enough to cause friction. But it wasn't an isolated move. It was part of something bigger. Kubrick was stripping the movie of guidance. At the same time he removed the original score, he started cutting dialogue. Explanations disappeared. Scenes that existed only to clarify meaning were quietly removed or shortened. This wasn't accidental. Kubrick believed explanations weakened the film. He didn't want audiences led. He wanted them dropped in and left alone. Then came the biggest cut of all. Kubrick had filmed an entirely different ending. The original version showed alien beings, the creators of the monolith, observing humanity. It explained who they were, why they intervened, what they represented. After reviewing the footage, Kubrick ordered it removed and destroyed. Not archived, not stored, destroyed. Only a few production stills survive. From a studio standpoint, this was madness. Endings are where audiences orient themselves. Endings are where confusion gets resolved. Kubrick did the opposite. He erased the answer and left only the question. By late post-production, 2001 had no traditional score, minimal dialogue, and an ending that explained nothing. MGM couldn't stop him. Too much money had been spent. Too much time had passed. Kubrick had all the leverage, and he used it. Whatever this film was now, it was going to be released exactly like this. And the studio had to hope the audience would understand something the studio itself didn't. They wouldn't. When 2001: A Space Odyssey finally premiered in April 1968, MGM expected confusion. They did not expect rejection. The first major screening, held in Washington, went badly almost immediately. Audience members started leaving before the first hour was over. No dialogue, long stretches of silence. Apes, no clear explanation of what they were watching or why. 2 days later, the New York premiere didn't go any better. People walked out again. This wasn't a subtle reaction. It was visible, embarrassing, and terrifying for a studio that had just spent years and millions backing a film they could barely explain themselves. One moment became legend. Actor Rock Hudson reportedly stormed out and asked, loud enough for others to hear, "Will someone tell me what the hell this is about?" That question summed up the problem perfectly. MGM executives sat through those screenings realizing they had a movie that violated almost every rule of commercial filmmaking. No clear plot, no emotional handholding, no reassuring ending, just images, silence, and ambiguity. Kubrick attended the screenings too, but he wasn't panicking. He watched people leave. He timed it. He took notes. He noticed most walkouts happened during the opening act. The long, dialogue-free sequence with prehistoric apes. From Kubrick's point of view, this wasn't failure. It was impatience. The studio pressured him to cut the film down, shorten it, make it clearer, explain more. Kubrick refused. At most, he trimmed a few minutes, not to clarify meaning, but to tighten pacing. The structure stayed intact. The silence stayed. The ending stayed unresolved. And for a brief window, it looked like MGM had backed a disaster. Critics were split. Some called the film hypnotic. Others called it boring, pretentious, or empty. Major publications couldn't agree on whether it was genius or nonsense. But then something unexpected happened. Younger audiences started showing up, college students, art crowds, people who weren't looking for reassurance. They didn't want answers, they wanted experience. The same things that drove early audiences out of theaters became the reason others lined up. Word spread slowly, then faster. The film didn't explode, it seeped. By the time MGM realized what was happening, 2001 had survived its most dangerous phase. Not because it changed, but because the audience did. And that survival came with consequences. Because even though the film eventually succeeded, it taught Hollywood a lesson they would never forget. 2001 didn't just survive its release, it changed behavior. Yes, the film eventually made its money back. Yes, it became a cultural landmark. Yes, its imagery rewired science fiction forever. That's the version people like to repeat. But that's not the lesson Hollywood took from it. What studios saw wasn't a misunderstood masterpiece. What they saw was a movie that almost collapsed under its own ambition. From the studio's perspective, 2001 was a nightmare scenario, a production that ran for years, a director who refused compromise, a final product that confused audiences on opening night, a hit that only became a hit after younger viewers reinterpreted it. That's not a business model. That's a warning sign. Executives didn't look at 2001 and think, we should fund more films like this. They thought, we got lucky. The takeaway wasn't creative freedom, it was risk management. Big-budget science fiction didn't disappear after 2001. It just changed direction. Studios started favoring clarity, momentum, heroes you could root for, villains you could identify, endings that closed the loop instead of blowing it open. Less ambiguity, more reassurance. Less silence, more spectacle. Within a decade, that path led straight to space operas, not space essay. The influence of 2001 is everywhere visually, but structurally, Hollywood ran in the opposite direction. Even the awards told the story. The film received multiple Academy Award nominations. It won only one, visual effects. The technical side was safe to celebrate. The ideas weren't. That would be the only competitive Oscar the director ever received in his entire career. That's the uncomfortable truth about 2001. It didn't fail creatively, it failed at launch. It asked too much patience from an audience that wasn't ready. It trusted viewers to sit with uncertainty. It refused to explain itself when explanation would have made things easier. Over time, the world caught up. The movie didn't change. We did. But in the moment, it nearly became a cautionary tale about what happens when ambition outruns comfort. That's why 2001 matters. Not because it was always loved, but because it survived long enough to be understood. And that's what really happened with 2001, A Space Odyssey. If this changed the way you look at the movie, good. That's the whole point. Most iconic films didn't become iconic the way people like to remember. They were messy, risky, and way closer to failure than success. So if you want more stories about what really happened behind the scenes, the bad decisions, the near misses, and the movies that barely survived their own ambition, subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.